Thank you so much for joining us on our panel. Today we will be focusing on the medical biotech startup journey, and we will be talking about all prevailing investment trends in medical biotech, highlight current challenges through the testimony of three of our panelists. The first one is going to be Duleek Ranatunga, co-founder and CEO at Pear Bio. It's one of the startups that are deep tech pioneers from our global challenge competition. Amanda Gett, partner at Kurma Partners, and Sofia Arnal, analyst at Adbio Partners. But before letting our panelists present themselves and tell us more about what they're doing, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about Hello Tomorrow and what we are doing here. So quickly about me, so I'm Salma. I'll be your host and moderator for this session. And Hello Tomorrow has celebrated officially its 10th anniversary this year. We've been sourcing the best international startups that are doing deep tech and connecting them with investors. And a little bit more generally, we've been gathering and helping all relevant stakeholders that are involved in the deep tech sphere, organizing events, and also gathering the whole ecosystem throughout those events and throughout everything that we've been doing throughout the years. The biggest event that we have is called the Global Summit. So this year it's going to be on March 21st and 22nd. It's our flagship conference with keynotes, speeches from startups, panels, and great networking opportunities. So without further ado, let's launch this session. And tell us about yourself. Maybe we could start with you, Amanda, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your role at Kurma and also what you're doing.
Sure, so happy to do that. So I'm part of Kurma Partners. I'm a partner with the team, and Kurma has a number of funds which are investing in different aspects of healthcare. So I'm part of the biotech team. We also have teams who are investing in diagnostics and health tech. And we also have a new group who's starting up in food and ag tech. So as part of biotech, we invest across the spectrum of development of companies, from company creation, taking projects from academia, and all the way out to clinical stage. So that's Kurma in a nutshell. I'm an immunologist by training from Sydney University and moved through pharma with Roche for a number of years in business development and in the Roche Venture Fund, and then moved to Paris in VC with some venture partners and now with Kurma.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amanda. And we have Sofia as well, who's from Paris. I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your role at Adbio Partners and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Selma. So I'm Sofia. So I'm an analyst at Adbio Partners. At Adbio, we are a fund dedicated to company creation and early stage investment in biotech companies. So we are based in Paris and in Barcelona since 2 years ago, but we were created in 2017 to fill the gap between the great academic research we do have in Europe and the later stage companies that are more mature. So we take the highest risk at Adbio, and we are not focusing on any particular area, but as long as there is an unmet medical need, we are here investing alongside researchers. And so as an analyst, I'm in charge of looking at new opportunities, doing the due diligence, mostly scientific, and then taking observer seats in portfolio companies to support the growth. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Sofia. How about Duleek? Tell us about Pear Bio and your role as a CEO.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Duleek. I'm CEO and co-founder of Pear Bio. So background in nanoengineering and a few patents in tissue engineering related fields. And basically that led to the creation of Pear Bio, which is a computational biology company that takes tumor samples and blood from cancer patients and creates predictive models on how patients respond to different treatments so that we can basically stratify patients based on response or non-response to treatment options. And basically we derive insights from that, like why do certain patients not respond to approved therapies, and what new medicines can we make that specifically go after patients with resistance to current targeted or immuno or chemotherapies. So now we're a 32-person team post Series A after raising $21 million in total. And we have 3 clinical trials actively in predicting patient response to approved therapies, and then 2 active drug discovery programs, one in oncology and one in immuno-oncology. And the general focus of us is, this idea behind find patients who respond to approved drugs, give them what works, find patients who don't respond to approved drugs, and make new medicines for the people who need it the most.
Thank you so much for the presentations. So we'll stick with you, Duleek. So you were talking about the fact that you are post Series A. How has your journey as a startup been? So from raising seed round to going post Series A, what changes really in both in that like stages of maturity of your company, and how have you noticed the changes?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is that we would classify ourselves as a tech bio company. It's important for us to have both wet lab and proprietary software working together to make our products. And I think what we've kind of seen as we went from pre-seed to seed to Series A is that a lot of the people that we went to fundraise from initially were tech investors, because it was sometimes difficult to show to biotech or pure biotech investors that the application of software to more traditional biology could yield to new insights and new IP, versus starting with a specific biological insight, like, chemistry experience at a certain drug modality, like, a new linker for an antibody drug conjugate. So our experience was that initially we, didn't have as many biotech VCs with tech knowledge, 4 or 5 years ago. And we had to really start with the tech VCs. But as we matured, I think inevitably being in the space, you're eventually going to line up with the biotech investors, right? And so over time, we've gotten more and more biotech people in, because the kind of product that we get at the end are tests and drugs, right? And, that requires that specific skill set. And as the product matures, it gets the kind of data that the biotech investors really like. And I think that's, a part of our journey is starting with, more tech investors, getting towards and aligning more towards biotech investors as we went to the Series A and beyond. And then I think otherwise, though, the vision of the company hasn't really changed all that much. It's still based on the idea of allocating treatment sufficiently to patients, the personalized medicine and oncology, right? And we still have the same philosophy that we've always had, which is that wet lab plus software is much more powerful than either of those two things alone.
Interesting, thank you. And so Amanda and Sofia, I know that you invest early stage, both funds. And so when you have startups that are platform based, do you feel like they are more solicited by tech investors? And what are the hurdles also that you see when you have more early stage startups that are coming up to you, and more researchers in general? Because I also know that both of you have also this particularity where you help researchers to build the company from scratch. So maybe Sofia, if you want to, I feel like maybe you want to go.
Yes. So yeah, it's really interesting what Duleek is mentioning, because of course we do see a lot of early companies, and we do see a lot more tech bio companies than we used to. And for tech bio, it's really interesting for us to partner with the companies that have a strong knowledge in science, but also the more technical knowledge in software and hardware. We had the example with a company we invested in, Astravius, which is enabling technology to produce cell and gene therapies. So the founder is really knowledgeable. He's an engineer, but he also a PhD in biotherapy. And really both expertise required at the board management, different funds that had more biotech and tech bio experience. So that way it merged really nicely, and to have, to be supported by investors that have the same level of experience, but in different fields, have been really interesting for the company.
Interesting. And how about you, Amanda? Do you feel the same way? Do you have solicitations from tech bio startups as well?
Yes, definitely. And it also depends on the strategy of the company and what the company wants to be. So a tech company which is really moving kind of into the diagnostics fields, these areas, then our diagnostic teams, our health tech teams are very expert on bringing those sorts of companies forward. For us, as we're focused on biotech, then we're really looking at companies that may have a tech, but then this becomes a company which develops products, and products being biotech therapeutics. And depending on which direction you're going to develop your company, then that also requires a very different skill set. So is this going to be a revenue generating company that is generating products which are being sold? Or is it going to be a therapeutic which then needs to go through the clinical development, the classic pathway for drug development? But in every case, having the synergy of different technologies, the expertise from the different elements is always really, really important. And I think that's that importance comes from both the technology and the founders, the companies themselves, but it's also very enriching from a board level. So if you can also have board members and investors who have different expertise from the different sectors is also very enriching.
Interesting. And so in that sense, you also have some companies that have both, that have at the same time a platform and an asset?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, which is also your case, Duleek, right? You don't get rid of the platform. It's something that is to always be used to kind of analyze again and again and create novel drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. So in our case, especially, we don't see our technology as a platform where first you use the platform to get a drug and then you get rid of the platform and then develop the drug clinically. In our case, because the platform is integrated into the clinic to get patient samples, to test them, to derive insights from the clinic, the idea is that even when our drugs get into the clinic, the actual platform is there to guide that kind of treatment decision. Who gets the drug? How do we do clinical development, right? And I think it just depends on what platform you build, right? Some platforms, they lose value, some platforms gain value, and some stay neutral, right? And our case, we want to build a platform that stays valuable even when you have assets in the clinic, so that you have both things, right? But also doing both things can be hard, right? So it just depends on what your technology is and what's the right business model for your technology.
Definitely. And so we were talking about data and AI. Have you, we've been hearing so much about it in the past year. Do you feel like AI is doing something different or revolutionizing the medical biotech field?
I'd say somehow simultaneously yes and no.
Okay.
Because I think, we're still in the very early days, right? Some of these things are so new that it hasn't really had time to show the actual effects that we want to see, and it hasn't had the time to actually show those effects, right? So people will, still point to the fact that there hasn't been an FDA-approved drug that was purely generated by AI, and that's true. So in that very purest sense, AI hasn't necessarily made as much of an impact as maybe the hype will say. But at the same time, I think every company, including all of the big pharmas, have used things like machine learning in different parts of their R&D workflows. So I think everyone has some benefit from it already. It's just that, maybe a pure product, purely discovered by AI, hasn't made it out there yet. I also don't think that's necessary, though, because I think AI, like anything, is a tool. Some of the people at Schrodinger talk about that too, right? Bragging about doing just any AI or just any ML right now is like bragging about using Excel 20 years ago. It's just a tool. And there's definitely companies that know how to use it better and companies that just try to cram that in anywhere, right? So I think knowing what kind of data you want to generate and what kind of AI tool is necessary is what's important. So for us, we work with image data, and specifically deep learning is very good for that, right? So we wouldn't build a LLM, for example, because that would just be us trying to align ourselves with the hottest sector within AI, but that wouldn't really benefit us that much. But deep learning is something that is a match for the data types that we work with, right? So we have multi-omic data, we have image data. Image data pairs well with deep learning, bioinformatic data, multi-omic data pairs well with machine learning, right? And right now, none of what we have yet really lines up with LLMs, for example. So I think just not having the hype, but applying your technology, the AI tool, to the type of data that you generate is very important, so that you don't build something useless or spend too much time doing something that doesn't make sense. So I think, everyone benefits right now from AI somehow. At least all the big pharma companies have adopted it in some way, whether it's drug design or patient stratification or just biomarker discovery, target discovery, right? So every big pharma has used AI in some way, and some more than others, but it's also not fulfilled its promise yet.
Perfect. So in that sense, if we move away from AI and we use it as a tool, Sofia and Amanda, how do you identify startups or researchers that have disruptive technologies and that you tell yourself, okay, this founder, I want to work with them, or this researcher, I want to work with them, I want to help them. What are the key pinpoints that you usually see, be it research, be it like a platform, be it like an asset, be it something specific that you see in startups that you've worked with in the past, where you were like, I feel like this can be revolutionary. I want to help this company.
Yeah, I guess it starts with something that they do that wouldn't be able to do before. So either it be addressing a target that would be undruggable before because it was too toxic or too broadly expressed, or having a new mechanism of making something work because they kind of unlock a bottleneck. So those would be the main entry point, I would say, and then seeing how they address it. So because at first it always seems beautiful and life changing, but then you dig a bit and you see what's really inside. So to bounce back on AI, I completely agree with Duleek that it must be seen as a tool, as not as the main concept, especially in biotech companies where you have a lot of deep knowledge. Showing that you can apply AI to maybe solve some of the issues could be really interesting as a way to go faster and smarter, but not at the main value creation point. So maybe using AI to unlock some of the current bottleneck could be interesting, but definitely not at the end of the day, it's not the most important point.
Definitely. What about you, Amanda? How do you feel about AI? And how do you feel about disruptive technologies if it's not AI in that case?
Yes, I mean, I would echo what the others have said as well, and AI is definitely a tool. And then the toolbox, it's part of the toolbox. So the other elements of the toolbox are kind of what assays does the team have, what data are they building from, and what data are they able to accumulate in future. And much of this is also very, very valuable. So upon what data sets are hypotheses being made, and access to samples, this is also extremely important. So it's really the gathering of the toolbox and then putting this together in order to make a reasonable hypothesis.
Perfect. And you're talking about the toolbox. If you were to name 4 or 5 things that you'd have in a toolbox for a startup, like what is your ideal project? Is there something specific that you look at when you look at a startup, either the stage, or I know that both of you are more like on the early stage, but more on the project side? Is there something specific besides obviously like solving a problem and unscrewing some issue that we have right now, but like, is there like some phases that the startups have to have gone through, or something specific that you look at, or you are more open to researchers coming up to you and explaining what they are doing, and then you discuss on a case-by-case scenario?
Yeah, it's really on a case-by-case scenario. So I guess there's two ways there's a push and pull. So on one hand, it's opportunistic, is to see what ideas are out there, what concepts are out there, and we're really open to that. On the other hand, we may also have some hypotheses or some areas that we really feel are very interesting, and then we'll do a deep dive in that area and then go proactively to search for what academics are doing what. And it doesn't have to be all in the one lab either. We're also very good at putting pieces together. And again, it's about building the synergies and having that toolbox from maybe different places, different universities, and having this collaborative effort to come together in synergy. And so really, we're really happy to start from a blank page and then build from there.
Yeah, and speaking about collaboration, so both of you also help startups and syndicate to help them raise funds. How does that work? So basically, when you have a startup coming up to you and you want to help them, so you bring more than capital, you also support them in securing other investors. How does that work?
Well, everything we do is very networked, and biotech, to create any viable biotech company, viable asset, requires a lot of input, and that means input in terms of intellectual input, resource, and network. So it's really important to create those links, and those links come from experience, from having been in the sector for a long time. And then one thing leads to another. So we very much like to have different groups working together from the academics and also from our own networks. We like to co-invest. So with Adbio, for example, we know each other, so we like to. And so it's always better to work with friends and people that you can work with together, because it's going to be a difficult path. We expect to be together for a long time. We may not always agree, but that's fine. And actually, if we all think the same, that's perhaps not the most synergistic relationship. But if we know that we all are aligned on a common goal, on a common plan, then we put our heads together, bring things together. And the links are also important to the broader industry as well. So pharma, for example, pharma is going to be either a collaborator or an acquirer of products in future. So really aligning kind of what their interests are, what's important to them, and so that we're all kind of aligned along a common journey.
Perfect, thank you. And what about you, Sofia? Do you also, I know that you both have the same stage maturity, so I think it's interesting also to hear from you on that part.
Yeah, totally. So completely aligned with Amanda. We often say that when we create or when we co-invest in an early stage company, it's like a small wedding because we don't know each other. Like an arranged wedding because we don't know each other, but then we will be in the same room and we will have to work together for many years because at the early stage we have to support the companies for a long time, and we really go through the worst and the best. So we like to work with people we know, that we like the ethics, that we like the strategy. And as Amanda mentioned, so as an early stage investor, we come here and we help build everything with the founder. So we are like a bit like a CXO, so Chief Everything Officer, for some people that might say so. So we do come here to help the founders raise money, so helping with our investor network, but also with our CEO and management network, because at this stage, it will be super interesting to prove the concept, but also to be able to transform. And to be able to transform, you need to have the right plan, the right budget, and also to de-risk and to be completely honest with your company, like what will be the main pain point and how you will address that. And this is why we like to syndicate a lot, because we like to share expertise and network. And we know that working with investors that have this kind of expertise can only better the company and the investment. So we are really open to syndication.
Lovely. And so, Duleek, I know that you're post-Series A, so you're a little bit more advanced in the stages of funding, but I'm curious to hear your experience about the seed rounds and also did you get particularly accompanied? I know that SOSV was one of your investors, and also were you more accompanied by more than capital, and how does it work like for the startup on the startup side?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'll put as a caveat is that the seed stage has changed, especially in tech bio and even parts of biotech since we did our seed round, like 4 years ago. So, some of this can be outdated. For example, in general, there weren't as many investors a few years ago, especially in tech bio and even to some degree seed stage biotechs, right? I mean, there's the ones that have always been around for decades and decades, but some of these funds are actually a bit newer, right? So I think, things have changed. There's more investors out there now, and there's more dry powder than there used to be in Europe, in the US, really like across the world, right? But yeah, basically, I think what we've learned at the seed round, for example, is that picking your lead investor is very key. Who you put on the board is key, because especially at the seed stage, things can still change quite a bit, especially if you have a platform, because you might think it's going in one direction and then you find that actually it's better suited for another problem, right? And I think one of the most important traits that we've seen out of the seed investors is flexibility and willing to follow you with the journey, because you might think that you have this one business model or this one product, and then you find out that it's not feasible or it doesn't get you the right return, and then you have to work on a different product. So that seed investors, I think, because they're very early on, them being overly aggressive in how they manage the company or pushing in the wrong direction, even when you have new information, can actually sink the company, right? So I think investors who are able to flexibly view new information as you come in, because you're on a learning journey together, is really helpful. Because if they learn with you as you build out what your technology is, then they can get you to the right Series A investors to actually grow the right business model and not force you into what business model they thought initially was the right one for you, right? So just flexibility, I think, is the most important thing in terms of who your series seed investors are. And of course, by the time you go into your Series A, them following on, them making intros to you is going to be very important as well. And yeah, I think our experience was that seed was actually the hardest round for us to raise. It took many months, and it goes back to being a tech bio platform where the IP is a mix of software and biology, and that makes it a bit harder for people to really see the novelty versus a single piece of patent that you can ascribe the value to, or a single asset even, right? That's even easier to ascribe value to. So seed for us was the harder bit, but the nature of computational biology sometimes is that it takes a bit more money for infrastructure, getting the equipment for your main assay. So for example, our proprietary work was on 3D cell cultures of tumor and immune samples. Mm-hmm. So these tumor immune co-cultures took a long time to develop. It required a lot of infrastructure spending on things like 3D live cell microscopy, and then the deep learning of computer vision applies to that, right? The software part of it. And, some investors can be very uncomfortable with the amount of money it takes to build infrastructure for a computational biology company. But, having someone, for example, if you're an infrastructure heavy company, invest into that is very important, because otherwise they'll cut you off prematurely before you even built the infrastructure to be able to create products. And then again, your company's sunk at that point, right? So that's, I think, a very important thing, and especially true for computational biology companies. I think that's why, some of the very successful new age of computational biology companies, and I say successful in the sense that they raised a lot of money, because they're not actually successful by real metrics like FDA approved drugs, right? But companies like Generate Biomedicines, which starts with $100 million plus, right? Now that's very unrealistic for most companies, but they invested a lot of money into cryo-EM, right? $15 million in units just to do cryo-EM. And then they use cryo-EM as their wet lab assay to look at antibody binding. And then they use generative AI to create new antibodies. They test, they improve the antibody, test again, and until they have like a very good antibody for a target of interest, right? Investors who are willing to put infrastructure in, if that's what you need, that kind of person as well. So for us, that was very applicable. For other companies, you might not need infrastructure, right? Maybe it's a pure software company where you really don't need infrastructure. But I think, depending on what you're building, people who are flexible and willing to invest in infrastructure are really important at seed stage.
Interesting. And so it's very important to kind of structure and outline the plan that you have going forward and further with the investors, correct?
Exactly, yeah. And it's not always easy, and you have to be flexible with new information, but the investors at least have to agree that with the round of funding that you're raising, are you doing it to get a product? Are you doing it to get a certain data point or catalyst? Or are you purely just building infrastructure, right? And, some investors, or maybe, for example, if you're trying to purely build infrastructures, most investors might say no, right? Because very few investors want to put money into infrastructure, right? Very few investors want to give you, $500,000 to buy a microscope, right? But if they agree with the longer term plan, you need to have that discussion with the person about what your long term plan is. But everyone on the table needs to be flexible still at all times at that stage, I think.
I think it portrays perfectly the marriage situation here, where Sofia was talking about that, where you have to make some concessions and you have to agree on the plan. And so you were talking about the fact that, the medical biotech and the tech bio, especially startup, is kind of a journey. So when you get onboarded on the journey, Amanda and Sofia, I guess you have already agreed to the pre-plan and to the structure of the startup. How does it work then to manage all the risks that the project may have? So in case they need more funds, or there is some regulations that are more at hand with the medical biotech side, how do you navigate that on your end? Maybe Sofia, you can go.
Yes, and I'll let Amanda complete, of course. But I think at first when we invest in the science and on the team. So then when we do the due diligence, we look at the plan and we see if it's realistic. We prefer to have, people saying, okay, it will take longer, but we are aware of the risk. Then people wanted to go to the clinic in 2 years. We think it's better to be realistic and to have some buffer, both in time and in money. So really often we redesign the plans with the scientific founders and with the team, and it's an open discussion, based on experience and on KOL advice and expert advice. So it's really common to redesign this plan. And then when we invest, when we commit to invest some money, it's tranched. So we have different objectives with milestones to obtain to then unlock the tranche. So this way it enables investors to still have control on the company, but also for the team to kind of be gratified when they reach the milestones they set for themselves. And also it's super flexible. So the milestones are, it's a long discussion to say, okay, we will unlock this kind of money when you reach those milestone. But since it's super important, it has to be really well defined and discussed, both with the board and with the team. And so this way, it's kind of I mean, when you reach the milestone, it's not flexible anymore. But the discussion was open, and so everyone could could share their concern concerning the milestones.
Mm-hmm.
So this way, there's no surprise, But we have a bumpy road until they're getting the milestones done. And we try our best to de-risk. And I think one aspect really important in the development plan is, as I mentioned before, but for the founders and the team to really know what would be the main pain point and how can they address in many ways those pain points. Maybe Amanda, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, Amanda, definitely. If you have something else to add up on the risks and how to de-risk that and regulation bit of the medical biotech startups.
Yes, I mean, as Sofia said, we think very, very hard before we invest, and we actually spend a lot of time, it can be months actually, particularly when you're in a company creation mode. We can spend months, even a year or more, just brainstorming on a concept and brainstorming on plans before even making that first investment. And then the plans will always have flexibility, so we know that biology often doesn't behave as we think it may. So bringing that thematic of flexibility in is extremely important. And then having a priority of activities as well, and already having backup plans, thought through contingency plans. So you know that you're going to have some surprises, and if one path falls apart, what is going to be your backup plan, and what is that going to look like? And what sort of contingencies do you need to have in place? So we try to be as efficient as possible with capital, but knowing that there are going to be some bumps along the way, then how much contingency do we need to build in so that we are ready for that additional capital should we need some extra wiggle room? And then that's where also we're tranching also, as Sofia mentioned, that's quite important because it's so high risk. Will we need that last tranche? Do we need to have a little extra tranche in there in case we need some extra capital or not? So trying to make the roadmap as comprehensive as possible, with as much thought around what we may need to be flexible on is really important from the start.
I understand. No, it makes sense. And so we talked about a little bit like the milestones and the road plan. What about for startups that basically have the road plan? Do you prefer that they go into the clinical phases faster on a smaller scale so that they can get a first draft of validation? How does it work, or is it not relevant?
It really depends. And again, much of the conversation that we've been looking at today is really around platforms, but it is also it is a certain investor that would like to invest in platforms because of that initial risk and the additional capital that is needed very early on to create the foundations for you to be able to reap then the value from that. Whereas a single asset company is you're very focused on moving that one thing through the regulatory pathways, through the experiments that you need to do to get that product to be a product. And your goal then is just almost going through the motions.
Makes sense.
Through. So it really depends on whether you're looking at a platform or an asset.
Yeah, and so when you are looking at an asset, I don't know how it happens in the UK versus Paris or in Europe in general, but how does it happen for the clinical phases? Is there a lot of spots to conduct them? Maybe Duleek, you can also tell us a little bit about the clinical trials that you do, but I'd love also to hear from Sofia and Amanda, like for those companies and researchers that you accompany, are they working with universities to do their clinical trials, and how does it work basically?
Yeah, I suppose. Clinical trials vary, of course, by every country by country, and it definitely varies disease by disease, right? So, it's hard to give any blanket advice. Rare diseases are very different from common diseases, for example, right? And the clinical development plan is very different. But I think, us being in oncology, there's very actively clinical trials everywhere, right? In Europe and the US, and there's sites that are always running phase 1, phase 2, phase 3s, right? Some places like to run certain trials more than others. Maybe some people don't like to run phase 1s and others do. But I think especially being in the UK, where you have the NHS, and the NHS is especially now trying to get even more ramp up in R&D. There's always active clinical trials going on, and generally you can find a partner, a hospital to work with for the trials. But it's a long and expensive process, right? It takes a while to draft a protocol, get it approved, get the PI, CI. So it's a long process. It's also quite expensive, and especially the late phase clinical trials, they're getting more and more expensive. And there's still that gap where biotechs generally are not good at running phase 3 clinical trials. That's still the domain mostly of big pharma. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, and it's hard to distill it all into a single blanket statement. But I think especially in a disease like oncology, there's always hundreds, if not thousands, of trials worldwide for new drugs, for new tests.
Perfect, thank you. And what about you, Sofia and Amanda? For the clinical trials, maybe as Duleek mentioned, maybe it's a case-by-case scenario, but just for some or one of the researchers that you've worked with recently, is it easier in Paris or in Europe to go through the clinical trials, and how does it work structurally?
I think it comes, clinical trial strategies is incredibly important. It's incredibly complex. For a small company, you can't do everything. And particularly in very early stages, you don't have the resource. So it's really about how can you best use resources to create the clinical evidence that you need to de-risk the asset. And that may mean, and that's bringing it back to the stratification questions, can you define a small patient population where you can demonstrate what you need to do to provide some evidence? Generally speaking, so you can do investigator-led trials, and these may be easier for a small company to do, but then you really need to make sure that you have an industry standard clinical trial so that this is interpreted appropriately and that this will be respected as meaningful data by a pharma company. So when you're looking at your indications, oncology is certainly there are a lot of trials, but that also means that you're competing for access to patients. Also understanding where you're going to fit into the treatment landscape, and so then you may need to have some flexibility in terms of geography of where your patients may be better sourced. So there's lots and lots of considerations that make it very much a case-by-case basis.
Makes sense. You have anything to add, Sofia, on that topic?
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to add that it's also part of the strategy we designed, as we mentioned before, when we designed the plan, the indication and the path to the clinic is also a really important decision. The model of an early stage fund is to push the product into the clinic and then to exit, selling it to a big pharma company that will have the means to develop it after. As Duleek mentioned, the phase 3 trial is more of a pharma job. And so usually when we talk with founders, we discuss about the potential indication, and we tend to go to unmet medical needs. So this way we can go fast into the clinic and have a clinical POC done on a small cohort of patients and try to prove the efficacy of the drug into the patient as fast as possible, and then maybe expand the indication on larger cohorts. But that would be one of the strategies we can implement as a VC fund. And as a pharmacist, I never imagined that indication was chosen like that before. So it's really interesting.
No, it makes sense. You have a background in as a pharmacist?
Yeah, I'm a pharmacist by training.
Makes sense. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think now you see the full spectrum of how it gets to be born. We were talking about also, you mentioned geographically, Amanda. Do you feel like opening up to a little bit like worldwide investors, be it early stage or a little bit later? Do you feel like it impacts the evolution of the startups? So, Sofia, you were talking about like pharma companies, and do you feel like having maybe like on board a foreign investor or somebody who is US based or in another country, do you feel like it helps the startup to get more credibility and to get more either more financing afterwards or easier approved FDA for drugs, or maybe be like get acquired or get an exit faster in a way? Do you feel like there is this about foreign investors?
Yeah, so I think in France and in Europe, we don't have to be ashamed about our science or our research because we are really strong. Actually, in France, we are leaders in medicine and a lot of different scientific areas. But what we like is really financing. Early stage financing is we really like it, and we like a bit of leadership and management. We are not as trained as in the US or maybe even in the UK as leaders. So usually we when we syndicate and we expand the network, it's interesting for investors, but also for management and for new CEO, CSO, and people that can take even board seats, independent board seats, that can bring overseas expertise. So this is why we like to syndicate. But as Amanda mentioned in the beginning, it's really all about networking. So it's always interesting to expand the network overseas.
Interesting. And how about you, Duleek?
So I would say, I mean, at the seed stage, you don't necessarily need international investors. And actually, a lot of seed companies do get investment from fairly local investors, right? But I mean, yeah, as you grow in stage, you tend to have to go further and further out. But investors are also more comfortable in spreading their geography of investment as you get into later stages, right? There are, for example, US funds that at seed stage like to invest locally, but at Series A go nationally, and at Series B go internationally, right? So I think the geography does open up naturally for the investors as well as the startups over time, which makes sense because at a seed stage you have to have more relationship building and you're working a bit more closely. And at Series B, for example, you'll have more big institutional investors, and there's fewer of them and in fewer geographies as well, which then I guess brings me to the next point. I think most biotech companies will have to at some point look at the US market and the US investors. One, because they have a lot of capital, and two, because a lot of drugs, especially, take off mostly in the US in terms of first approval, first big sales, the blockbuster potential. Again, varies by disease, right? So maybe certain tropical diseases that the US is not the right market, right? But in oncology, again, as an example, the US makes up a huge chunk of the global oncology market. I think for new drugs, some of the big blockbuster drugs that went very quickly into blockbuster status, they had something like 33 to 50% of their sales come from the US and the rest globally. Mm-hmm. So a large part of your sales will be in the US, which means you'll get US approval. The majority of new drugs and biologics for disease are approved by the FDA before another regulatory agency. There's exceptions sometimes. So I think actually it was one of the hemophilia gene therapies this year actually got approval in the UK right before the US. This is a very rare instance of the UK having approval before the US. That rarely happens. Sometimes Europe gets an approval ahead of the US, but the FDA tends to be where more first approvals happen anyway. And the FDA is very scrutinizing on data. They actually look at the raw data. We've engaged with the FDA a few times now, but I think what we like about with the FDA is that while they might scrutinize your data a lot, your raw data, your methods, how you plan trials and all that, they also give very active feedback, and they do it in a time limit, right? So these FDA timelines, some of the applications you make, they have to respond within 90 days or 100 days. So it's a very kind of reliable, streamlined system to talk to the regulators, show them what you're doing, get their feedback, and make sure that you're designing trials to get the data that the regulator will approve. And I think then as a result, a lot of people will get regulatory approval in the US first, they'll reach blockbuster status because of the US sales, right? And that's where I think investors at some point become valuable, but not necessarily at seed. I think depends on the company, right? The US investors might be valuable at Series A. it might be valuable at Series B. There are some maybe that have gone only through Europe and still became big because the big pharma are still very active in Europe, right? So by working with local investors and big pharma, you could still do something. But I think, somehow most biotech products end up having a home in the US as their single biggest market for sales. So I think you always have to think about the US market. I'm also a bit biased about that, but I think most products have had that experience in the past.
Because you also are based in the US, right?
So we also have a US lab and office now, and we are actually technically a US topco but with R&D and headquarters in the UK. So there's that as well. But I mean that's also purposely done, right? Because the US is going to be our biggest market.
Yeah, but I also so I go with what you're saying, Duleek and Sofia as well, about capital being lacking a little bit in Europe. So it's not particularly about research and science that is lacking. It's more capital that is a bit lacking. And we see it as well when we analyze the trends of investment in Europe compared to the US, who are machines at generating projects and at pushing founders and at pushing people to go into entrepreneurship in general. So Amanda, how do you feel about that? Do you also have US investors going in with you on your syndications? And do you work sometimes with foreign, not specifically US, but also Europe based?
Yes, definitely. I mean, as I said, we really like to syndicate, and having syndication from different geography adds as an additional richness to both the vision of the company, but also again to the network, to then accessing more capital. You just spread your optionality.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your insights. So maybe we can end on a sweet tone. I'll ask each one of you to give maybe 2 or 3 tips to medical biotech founders today. If you were to speak with them, what are the advice that you would give to each of them? Duleek, you can do the honors.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it all starts with good science, right? And I think Europe has very good science, and sometimes it just doesn't get commercialized. So I think first ingredient is a good basis of what you're building. Second thing I'd say is just network a lot, right? Because I think especially in the computational or tech bio space, it's a new group of people that are coming up and building these companies, right? And if you are, for example, building your company for the first time, you just have to network a lot. You have to network with the academics, the big pharma, the investors, the biotech, executives, right? So you just have to network, and you have to network, I think, pretty globally, right? I think at the very least, if you're building a biotech, you need to network in Europe and the US, and depending on what you do, possibly China as well. So yeah, second one is network. And I think just generally be prepared for everything taking longer, requiring more capital than you expect, and just prepare for a lot of setbacks, right? Happens to, I think, pretty much every company. Everything takes longer and more money than people expect.
Lovely. Thank you. What about you, Sofia?
So I would say to trust your project, of course, but be honest with yourself. Really look at your project and at yourself, and if you don't manage to raise, ask yourself why, but in a really open way. And then I would say work with investors which you trust, because we kind of often forget, but the investors and the founders' vision is aligned. At the end of the day, we want the same thing. We want the company to succeed. So I think we really have to keep that in mind in all the negotiation and in all the road. And that this way we can work with trust and hand in hand.
Perfect. And last, Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's exciting times, and there certainly is capital to invest in companies, and investors are certainly very, very open to doing that. And so have those conversations early. Many investors are really happy to engage early, even if it's just an early conversation, and then to help structure ideas, help structure thoughts so that that you can continue working and then build an investable case in future.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think we can close this panel on these great notes. Thank you, Amanda, Sofia, and Duleek for joining us again. And thank you for everybody who's watching us or is going to watch the broadcasting of it. Thanks a lot and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Bye.